If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The wind came from the south that evening, carrying sand and the smell of dry sage. The plains stretched out in all directions, flat and endless, with nothing but the faint line of distant hills to break the horizon. A small ranch sat in the middle of it. One barn, one house, a half-broken fence, and a windmill that turned with a tired groan. Elias Ward rode in slow, his horse breathing heavy from the heat. His limp showed even in the saddle, the right leg stiff, the boot heel worn uneven. He dismounted with a quiet grunt and looked over the land. It had been another long day repairing fence posts and hauling water for cattle that barely had anything to graze on. He didn't expect much from the land anymore, but the work gave him something to do. Elias had once been a cavalry scout. He'd left the army 6 years ago after a raid that went wrong, badly wrong. A village burned, women and children lost. He hadn't spoken much since then. The ranch had belonged to his father. Now, it was his only reason to stay alive. He didn't drink much, didn't visit town except for supplies, and hadn't spoken to a soul in weeks. He tied the horse to the post and turned toward the barn. That's when he saw movement in the dirt near the fence. A small shape trying to crawl, half hidden by the fading light. He reached for his rifle instinctively, but then stopped when he saw what it was. A woman. She was young, maybe 20, her face streaked with dust and blood. Her dark eyes were open but glassy, her breathing shallow. The fabric on her shoulder was torn, soaked with dried blood. She tried to push herself up but fell again, trembling. Her long black hair was tangled and matted with sand. Elias's first thought was that she might be an Apache. His chest tightened. He'd seen enough war to know what that meant, and what would happen if anyone found her here. For a moment, he stood still, rifle still in his hand, his mind torn between fear and duty. She looked up at him suddenly, her expression filled with confusion and panic. Her voice came out broken. "No soldiers," she whispered. "Please, no soldiers." The words hit him harder than he expected. He lowered the rifle, knelt beside her, and saw the fear in her eyes. The same kind of fear he used to see in the faces of people when the cavalry came through their villages. "You're hurt," he said quietly. She nodded once, barely able to keep her eyes open. Her hand moved weakly toward her shoulder. He hesitated again. He knew what helping her meant. If the army found out he was sheltering a native woman, they'd take everything, his land, his freedom, maybe his life. But leaving her here would mean letting her die, and that thought stayed in his chest like a stone. He made his decision without another word. He holstered his rifle and slid his arms under her, lifting her carefully. She was light, bones and bruises under the dirt. She tried to resist for a moment, but her strength was gone. Inside the house, he laid her on the small cot near the fireplace. The room smelled of smoke and coffee and old wood. He fetched a bowl of water and a clean rag, then began cleaning the wound on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't cry out. When he reached for the whiskey bottle, she tensed, her eyes wide again. "It's just for cleaning," he said quietly. "Not for pain." He poured a few drops onto the rag and pressed it to the wound. She winced, her hand gripping the blanket. He worked carefully, wrapping her shoulder in a torn strip of sheet. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the strength underneath it. When he finished, he handed her a cup of water. She drank slowly, her hands trembling. "Name?" he asked. She swallowed, her voice hoarse. "Nayeli." He nodded once. "Elias." She looked around the cabin, studying everything as if deciding whether it was safe. The room was plain, a table, a few tools, a rifle by the door, a kettle over low firelight. The only sound was the wind against the window panes. After a while, her eyes closed. Elias watched her breathing slow and steady. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his leg where the pain had started to pulse again. He knew this was the beginning of trouble, but it was also the first time in years that his house didn't feel completely empty. As the fire burned low, he looked at her sleeping face. The dirt, the bruises, the fear that still lingered even in rest. And he thought about how far she must have come to reach this place. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. only that she wouldn't survive another night outside. He stayed by the fire, watching over her until dawn. Outside, the plains were silent. The war, the raids, and the soldiers all felt far away for a moment. Just two people in a cabin, both broken in their own ways, waiting for the sun to rise. Morning came with a pale light that slipped through the cracks of the wooden walls. The fire had burned down to ash, and the room was cool. Elias sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He hadn't slept much. Every sound outside, the creak of the windmill, the cry of a hawk, made him tense. The woman was still there, sleeping on his cot, her breathing slow and shallow. He wasn't used to company. His home had been silent for years, and now that silence had shape and weight. He stood and limped toward the door. The pain in his leg was sharp that morning, the kind that made him stop halfway to take a breath. He looked outside. The plains were wide, flat, and empty as always, but now he felt the space differently. Someone else was depending on him, even if she didn't mean to. Behind him, he heard a faint sound, the movement of the blanket. He turned. She was awake, eyes open, watching him carefully. "You're safe here," he said. His voice came out rough from the night's silence. She didn't answer, only glanced at the doorway, then at him again, as if measuring whether she believed the words. He poured her a cup of water and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Her brow furrowed. She didn't understand everything. He tried again, slower. "Who hurt you?" She looked down. "Soldiers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Camp, near river. Many gone." He nodded once, the tension in his shoulders tightening. That was what he'd suspected. He had seen those camps before, seen how the army kept peace. He didn't ask more. She was alive. That was enough for now. He set a pot on the stove, started coffee again, and cracked a few eggs into a pan. The smell filled the room. When he placed the plate in front of her, she stared at it like she didn't know what to do. "Eat," he said. After a few seconds, she picked up the fork and began to eat slowly. He noticed her hands. They were cut and blistered, the marks of running and hiding. She was hungry but careful, as if afraid he might take the food away. He looked away to give her space. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt something move inside him that wasn't guilt or exhaustion. It was small, maybe respect, maybe pity, but it stayed. When she finished eating, she tried to stand. Her legs gave out halfway, and Elias reached for her without thinking. She froze when he touched her arm, flinching hard. He stepped back immediately. "It's all right," he said softly. "I won't hurt you." She nodded, but didn't look at him. He saw the fear still burning behind her calm face and knew it wasn't just from what happened last night. It was from years of running, of being hunted. He understood that kind of fear. She managed to stand, holding the wall for balance. "Go," she said, motioning toward the door. He realized she wanted to help. He hesitated, then nodded. "You can rest," he said. She shook her head once. "Help." He gave her an old wool shawl to cover her shoulders and led her outside. The morning air was cool, and the valley smelled of dry grass and smoke from last night's fire. The horse neighed softly when it saw them. Naeli, he remembered her name, moved slowly but steady, her bare feet brushing against the dirt. Elias began checking the fence line, hammering loose nails, pulling wire tight. She stood nearby, watching every move. When she saw him struggle to lift a plank, she stepped forward and grabbed the other end without being asked. They didn't speak. By noon, the sun was high and the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet rhythm of two people working to survive the same day. When they went back inside, Elias poured water from the barrel into a basin and nodded for her to wash up. She cleaned her face and arms, the water turning brown with dirt. When she was done, he handed her one of his spare shirts. She looked confused. "You can wear it," he said. "Yours is torn." She hesitated but took it, turning away modestly to change. The shirt hung loose on her, but it was clean. For a moment, she looked less like someone who had fled from death and more like someone who could stay. Later that evening, when the firelight softened the edges of the room, Elias sat near the table, carving a piece of wood in silence. Naeli sat by the window, sewing the tear in her deerskin dress. The soft scrape of his knife and the quiet pull of her thread were the only sounds. He spoke without looking up. "You can stay here until you're strong enough to go." She looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Go where?" He stopped carving. That was a good question, one he hadn't thought through. She had no tribe left, no family, nowhere to go. And if she left, soldiers would find her. "I don't know," he said finally. She nodded, lowering her eyes again. "Then I stay." He didn't answer. He only set the knife down and leaned back, listening to the wind outside. That night, after she fell asleep, Elias sat alone by the dying fire. He thought about what would happen if someone saw her here, if the soldiers came back. He could lie once, maybe twice, but not forever. Yet when he looked at her sleeping form, the thought of turning her out into the wild again felt impossible. For years, he had lived without purpose, just keeping things alive enough not to fall apart. But now there was something else. Not redemption, not exactly, but something that made him stay alert, something that pushed back against the emptiness he'd carried for too long. When the fire finally burned down to embers, he realized his decision had already been made. She would stay. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his own house. The following week brought colder mornings and sharper winds from the north. Elias woke early, as he always did, but now he wasn't the only one moving inside the house. He could hear Nayeli stirring quietly near the fire, feeding it with small pieces of wood before the first light came through the cracks in the shutters. The house no longer felt like a hollow place. It carried sound again. She had been with him for 12 days. Her shoulder wound was healing, her steps steadier, and her eyes less filled with fear. Still, when he spoke, she often paused before answering, as if measuring every word. He didn't press her to talk. He learned that silence could hold more truth than speech ever could. That morning, she was grinding dried corn with a stone, the sound steady and rhythmic. Elias poured coffee and sat across from her, watching. "You don't have to do that," he said. She shook her head without looking up. "We're good." He nodded. "Work's all there is out here." He noticed she was wearing one of his old shirts again, the sleeves rolled up, the collar loose. It made her look less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged there, though neither of them would say that aloud. When the meal was done, they stepped outside. The air was sharp, the sky pale blue, and the land stretched silent in every direction. Elias walked with his limp steady, carrying a small axe and a coil of rope. Nayeli followed with a basket. They cut wood for the stove and checked the fence line that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The land had no mercy. It cracked, it broke, demanded patience. She worked quietly, matching his pace, and when she saw him wince and rest his leg, she took the heavier load without being asked. By midday, the wind had shifted. It carried a distant sound, a horse, maybe two. Elias stopped, squinting toward the ridge. Dust rose in the distance. "Stay close," he said. Nayeli froze, her face tightening. "Soldiers?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Maybe." He led her back toward the house quickly, his limp more pronounced now. She went inside while he stayed near the corral, pretending to check the saddle straps. Within minutes, two riders appeared on the trail. Cavalrymen, blue coats, rifles at their sides. One of them, a young lieutenant with a clean face and shiny boots, raised a hand in greeting. "Afternoon, sir. Sorry to bother you." Elias straightened. "You're not bothering me." The officer's horse shifted beneath him, restless. "We're tracking a runaway from the holding camp down by the canyon. An Apache woman. Took off last week. You seen anyone come through here?" Elias looked calm, though his pulse pounded. "No, haven't seen a soul in weeks." The officer nodded slowly, eyes moving past Elias toward the barn and the house beyond it. "Mind if I take a look around?" Elias met his gaze. "You can look all you want. Just don't scare my horse." The lieutenant gave a thin smile, dismounted, and walked toward the barn. Elias followed, his hand close to his belt knife. The soldier peered inside, saw nothing but tools, hay, and the horse. He nodded. "Looks fine." When he turned to leave, his eyes landed on the window of the house. There was movement, barely visible. Nayeli had pulled the curtain aside for half a second before realizing her mistake. Elias stepped forward, blocking the officer's view. Wind, he said simply. The lieutenant's eyes lingered for a moment, then drifted away. All right then, he said. If you do see anything, report to Fort Mason. Elias nodded once. Sure. The two soldiers rode off, leaving a trail of dust behind them. He watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned toward the house. Inside, Naeli stood near the corner, her eyes wide, her breath fast. Elias closed the door gently. They're gone, he said. She swallowed hard. They come again? Maybe, he admitted, but not today. Her hands were shaking. He could see it even though she tried to hide them in the folds of her shirt. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her arm, slow, careful. She flinched at first, then didn't pull away. You're safe here, he said quietly. She looked up at him, studying his face, trying to find out if he meant it. Then she nodded once. For the rest of the day, they barely spoke. Elias mended the fence behind the barn. Naeli worked in the garden, pulling dry weeds and stacking wood. But the silence between them wasn't cold. It was the silence of two people who shared the same fear and chose not to run from it. That night, they ate in silence again. He caught her glancing toward the door once, and he said, If anyone comes back, I'll handle it. She hesitated. You lie to soldiers, she said softly. He nodded. I did. Why? He looked down at the table, his jaw tightening. Because I've done worse things for worse men. I don't owe them anything anymore. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. The corners of her mouth softened, not quite a smile, but close. After dinner, she took his coat and began sewing a tear near the pocket. He watched her for a while, the needle moving in and out under the lamplight. Her movements were slow, focused, patient. It struck him how quiet her presence was. No demands, no questions, just quiet help. He realized then that he didn't even know her story fully. He knew she had escaped the camp, but not why, not what she'd left behind, not who she'd lost. Part of him wanted to ask, but another part knew it didn't matter. Survival was enough explanation. Outside, the night was clear. The stars looked sharp against the black sky, and the air smelled like pine and smoke. He stepped out to check the horses one last time and saw her watching from the doorway. For a moment, she seemed uncertain whether to follow him or stay. He nodded once. It's all right. She stepped onto the porch beside him. The wind brushed strands of her hair across her face. They stood together without talking, looking out at the quiet valley. Elias spoke after a while, his voice low. I used to think this land was empty. Turns out I was the one that was. She didn't understand every word, but she watched him, eyes steady, the firelight from inside catching her face. He looked down at her and saw no fear there now, just exhaustion and something that looked like trust trying to take shape. That night, when he finally lay down, he noticed the house didn't feel like it belonged to just him anymore. The wind outside no longer sounded lonely, it sounded alive. Winter came down from the hills fast that year. The mornings turned white with frost, the grass stiff underfoot, and the wind cut through the ranch with a dry, steady howl that made the shutters rattle. Elias had covered the windows with heavy cloth and patched the roof before the snow came. Naeli helped without complaint, carrying wood, mending blankets, even fixing the barn latch when it froze. It surprised him how quickly she had learned the rhythm of the place. The soldiers hadn't returned since that afternoon, but Elias knew they might. He checked the ridge every morning through his field glasses and kept his rifle clean by the door. At night, though, when the cold pushed them closer to the fire, that fear seemed smaller, pushed away by the work, the silence, and the strange comfort of having someone else moving in the same space. Her shoulder wound had healed into a faint scar, and she moved easily now. Sometimes he caught her humming softly while sweeping the floor or stirring the pot on the stove, melodies that didn't belong to any song he knew. There were old, wordless things, quiet and calm, like prayers spoken to the land itself. One evening, while chopping wood, he saw her standing in the doorway watching him. Snowflakes clung to her hair, melting down her cheek. Cold, she said with a small smile. He grunted. You'll freeze standing there. She stepped out anyway, taking up one of the smaller pieces of wood. I help. He wanted to tell her to go back inside. that it wasn't her job, but the words didn't come. She stood beside him, her breath turning to mist, matching his movements. Every few minutes, he looked over to make sure her hands weren't turning blue. She caught him once and gave a quiet laugh. It startled him, the first time he'd heard her laugh at all. Later, inside, she made stew for dried beans and salt pork. She added something else, a small pouch of crushed herbs she kept in her bag. The smell was sharp, unfamiliar, but it warmed the cabin quickly. Elias sat down at the table, rubbing his sore leg. She noticed and poured him a cup of hot water with herbs, pushing it toward him. "Drink," she said. He frowned but took it. The taste was bitter, but it eased the ache after a while. "You know medicine," he said quietly. She nodded. "My mother teach. Before soldiers." He hesitated. "Your mother? She's gone?" Her eyes flicked toward the fire. "All gone." He didn't ask more. The way she said it told him everything. That night, she sat by the fire sewing patches on his coat again. He watched her fingers move, quick and steady, and thought about how easily she fit into the place. It made him uneasy. For years, the ranch had been only his silence, his work, his ghosts. Now, without warning, someone else had filled it with life again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You could leave when the snow melts. Head south, maybe. There's safe towns." She shook her head. "No tribe, no family. South, north, same." She looked up at him, her face steady. "Here I stay." He looked into her eyes, saw no fear there anymore, only calm certainty. He gave a small nod. "Then you stay." The weeks passed in the slow rhythm of the frontier. Each morning began with chores. Each night ended with firelight. They worked without talking much, feeding the horse, repairing fences, boiling snow for water. Sometimes she told him small things, how she once rode bareback with her brother, how she had seen the river freeze over when she was a child. He never spoke of the war or what happened there, but she could see it in the way his eyes changed when he heard distant gunfire echoing off the hills. One afternoon, while mending his saddle, Elias felt the pain in his leg spike. He tried to hide it, but she saw. She knelt beside him and unwrapped the old cloth around the wound. The skin was scarred and red, the muscles stiff. She brought a warm towel and pressed it gently against his thigh. "You help too much," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "You walk. I help walk better." He wanted to tell her that he'd been walking like this for years, that nothing could fix it, but her hands were steady and the heat eased the stiffness. He let her continue. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and heavy, covering the plains in silence. Inside, the fire threw light across the walls. The house felt small but safe, as if the world beyond had been shut out for good. That night, she sang again, quietly, almost under her breath. He didn't understand the words, but the sound filled the room with a strange peace. He thought of how far she must have come, how much she had lost, and how easily she had begun to live again. When the song ended, she looked at him. "You know sleep?" He shook his head. "Not much." "Bad dreams?" she asked. "Sometimes." She nodded, understanding without asking more. Then she added, softly, "Dreams stop when morning comes." He looked at her for a long time. "Yeah," he said, "they do." That night, he slept longer than he had in years. By morning, the snow had stopped. The world outside was bright, white, and still. He opened the door to a silence, so complete it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Nayeli came up behind him, wrapped in a blanket, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Pretty," she said simply. He looked at her, then at the land. "Yeah," he said, "pretty." And for the first time, he realized he wasn't just keeping her alive anymore. He was learning how to live again himself. When the thaw came, it came slowly. The snow melted into streams that cut through the dirt, feeding the cracked earth that had waited all winter. The valley began to smell of wet soil and new grass. Elias stood at the fence line one morning, watching the cattle move sluggishly through the mud, their breaths heavy with steam. Beside him, Nayeli worked to lift a fallen fence post. She had grown stronger over the months, her movements more sure, her eyes clearer. The fear that once shadowed her face had faded, replaced by quiet confidence. Elias had seen change before, The seasons, the land, people who came and went, but this felt different. He realized he hadn't thought about the soldiers in weeks. He still checked the ridge from time to time, but it was habit, not fear. Life had fallen into a rhythm that felt real. That morning, as they worked side by side, Naeli stopped to brush dirt from her hands. "You don't talk much," she said, half teasing. Elias leaned against the fence post. "Never had much to say." She looked at him and smiled faintly. "You think too much." He gave a short laugh. "Maybe." It was small talk, but it was something new, easy, unguarded. The kind of exchange he hadn't had in years. After the chores, they sat on the porch to rest. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and would smoke. Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. She drank it slowly, her eyes fixed on the far hills. "You miss your home?" he asked. She thought for a long time before answering. "I miss people, but home. Home burned. Not there now." He nodded. "Yeah, I know that feeling." She turned to him. "Your family? My father died here. Mother before him. No wife. No kids." He paused. "There was a woman once before the war. She left when I came back. Couldn't stand the man I turned into." Naeli studied him quietly. "You still man. Just quiet man." He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. "Quiet doesn't mean good." She didn't argue, but the way she looked at him, steady, patient, felt like a kind of answer anyway. In the following days, the land began to green. Birds returned to the fence posts, and the horses grew restless with the warmer air. Elias and Naeli planted a small garden behind the cabin, using seeds he'd kept stored for years but never bothered to sow. She showed him how to mix crushed herbs with soil to keep insects away, and he showed her how to mark the furrows straight. Their hands brushed sometimes, neither of them pulling away. One afternoon, they shared bread and salt pork at the table. The sunlight fell through the window across her face. Elias noticed the scar on her shoulder, thin, pale, almost gone now. It reminded him of the first night he found her near the barn, broken and afraid. The memory hit him hard, not with guilt this time, but something else, something close to gratitude. "Why did you stay?" he asked suddenly. She looked at him, puzzled. "Where go?" He hesitated. "I mean, you could have left. When the snow cleared. You didn't owe me anything." She set down her cup. "You saved me. Feed me. No one do that before. You hurt too, but you stay." "I stay too." He looked away, feeling the weight of her words more than he expected. "You don't owe me your life." "I don't," she said softly. "I give it." He didn't speak for a while after that. The fire cracked softly in the stove, and the light dimmed as clouds moved over the sun. There was nothing romantic or exaggerated about her words. They were plain, simple truth. It unsettled him because it left no room for denial. That evening, rain began to fall. Not a storm, just a steady, cleansing rain that made the roof hum softly. Elias sat by the window, whittling wood, while Naeli mended one of his shirts. The quiet was warm. Every few minutes, she hummed under her breath, that same low melody from the winter. After a while, he said, "When you first came here, I thought it was temporary, that I was just keeping you alive long enough to move on. But now," he stopped, unsure how to finish. She looked up from her sewing. "Now," he met her eyes. "Now it feels like you're part of this place. Like you belong here." She smiled, not why, but honest. "Then I stay. If you want." He nodded once. "I want." The words surprised even him, but they came out steady. She didn't reply. Instead, she folded the finished shirt and set it beside him. The firelight flickered across both their faces. Later that night, as the rain continued, Elias lay awake listening to the steady sound on the roof. The years of loneliness, the guilt, the old pain, all of it felt quieter now, pushed back by the small sounds of life in the cabin. He turned his head toward the cot where Naeli slept. Her breathing was slow and calm. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't waiting for something to end. He was living it. Outside, the rain washed the dust from the land, and the valley began again. Summer spread across the valley like a slow breath. The grass turned high and soft under the horses' hooves, and the air smelled of earth and sun-warmed pine. Elias worked shirtless in the heat, mending the corral fence while Naeli gathered herbs in the shade near the creek. The sound of water running over stone mixed with the buzz of insects, filling the quiet between them. They had lived together through a full cycle of seasons now. There were still hard days, but not the empty kind. The house looked lived in, the walls clean, the tools hung neatly, jars of dried herbs lined up by the window. Elias had stopped counting time by months and started marking it by small things. The first rain, the day the calves were born, the first time he heard Naeli laugh without hesitation. The scar on his leg still ached, but he walked better now. Most days he forgot about it, until the evening when the work caught up with him. Naeli noticed before he said anything. She always did. Some nights, she would hand him a hot cloth and motion for him to sit. He'd pretend to protest, but he let her. "Still hurts?" she asked one evening. He nodded. Some days more than others. She pressed the cloth gently against the scar. "Pain stay too long, it becomes friend." He smiled faintly. "Not the kind of friend I wanted." She looked up at him, serious now. "But it keeps you alive. Reminds you to walk careful." He didn't answer, but her words stayed with him. By mid-July, the ranch had a rhythm. Work, rest, quiet meals, and short talks that meant more than long ones ever could. They didn't speak of leaving anymore. The idea of after had simply disappeared. Then one afternoon, the rhythm broke. Elias was fixing the gate when he heard horses again, 2, maybe 3, coming fast from the ridge. He knew the sound too well. His stomach tightened. He turned toward the house. "Naeli," he called, voice low but urgent. She stepped out onto the porch, her hands still wet from washing dishes. Her face changed instantly when she heard it too. "Inside," he said. She obeyed without argument. He took his rifle from where it hung inside the door and stood on the porch as the riders appeared over the rise. Dust followed them down the slope. Soldiers. The lead rider was older this time, with gray hair under his hat and the weary posture of someone who had seen too much. The others hung back. "Afternoon," the officer said as he dismounted. "We've been told there's a native woman living near these parts. Escaped from the camp last winter. You seen anyone matching that?" Elias's voice was steady. "No one here but me." The officer's eyes moved to the corral, the garden, the extra washing hanging by the line. "You live alone?" "I do." The older man studied him for a long moment, then looked toward the house. For a second, Elias thought it was over, that the soldier would demand to look inside. But the officer just sighed, pulling off his gloves. "I've been out here too long to start digging into every rumor," he said. "If you see anything, tell the post at Fort Mason." "I will," Elias said. The soldier nodded once, remounted, and turned his horse toward the ridge. "Stay safe out here, Ward. The plains don't forgive easy." Elias watched until the riders disappeared into the heat shimmer. Only then did he lower the rifle. Inside, Naeli stood by the window silent. He closed the door gently and leaned the gun against the wall. "They're gone," he said. She didn't move. "You lie again," she whispered. He nodded. "I did." Her eyes filled, not with fear this time, but with something heavier. "You lose much for me if they find out." He shook his head. "I already lost everything once. I'm not doing it again." She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "Why?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because I'm tired of watching people disappear. You stay. That's enough reason." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out and touched his arm, hesitating at first, then resting her hand there firmly. "Then I stay, always." That night, the sky turned deep red over the valley. The air was warm and still, the kind of evening when sound carried far. They ate on the porch, their plates balanced on their knees, watching the last light fade. Elias glanced toward the horizon. "You ever think about what comes next?" Naeli shook her head. "This is next." He smiled slightly. "You might be right." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a while they just watched the stars appear one by one. The silence between them was no longer made of fear or uncertainty. It was peace, plain and complete. In the weeks that followed, the ranch settled back into its rhythm. Elias built a second corral for new calves. Naeli planted corn in neat rows. She began teaching him words in her language, short, simple ones. He remembered them badly, but she laughed and kept trying. By late summer, their small world had become its own kind of family. Two people who had both lost everything, now keeping something alive together. When autumn came again, the air turned dry and cool, and the hills burned gold under the sun. The land looked the same as when Elias first found her by the fence, but everything else had changed. The loneliness had lifted, replaced by something real and quiet that neither of them needed to name. One evening, as they stood watching the sunset from the porch, Elias took her hand. She looked up, surprised but calm. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The gesture said what words couldn't, that she wasn't a guest anymore, and this place wasn't just his. They stayed there until the light was gone. When they finally went inside, the house felt warm and full, the air thick with the smell of stew and firewood. Outside, the wind moved softly through the grass. The valley that had once felt like a place of endings now held something entirely different. A beginning that asked for nothing except the will to stay. The end.